I never expected to see a machine in my lifetime that we could talk to in English. AI as this alien species that's descended on the planet for the first time, inhabiting the planet with an alien species of our own creation, but that is incredibly intelligent and becoming smarter by the day. I've spent my life sort of trying to use AI as a differentiator because other people weren't doing it, and so I felt, hey, this is low-hanging fruit, but now you're right, it's become a crowded kind of a space.
Yo, it's the future, don't hit the snooze. AI is here giving humans the boost. Team Humans rolling, brains in the game with Dan Turchin. Y'all remember the name. People rain in the mix, no stopping the flow. Better work, better life, yeah, we're ready to go. Robots and humans, a collab, you know. Okay, let's start the show.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're listening. Welcome back to AI and the Future of Work, episode 399. I'm your host, Dan Turchin, CEO of PeopleRain, the AI platform for IT and HR employee service. If you enjoy this episode or any other, you owe it to humanity. Pay it forward, share it with just one friend or maybe even a loved one who might benefit from these conversations. And of course, if you share more details about a particular episode that you enjoyed, I just may share it from the mailbag in an upcoming episode. Here's one that we pulled from Sal in Chicago, who's a management consultant. Sal's favorite episode is number 289 from 2024 with Atif Rafiq, best-selling author of The Decision Sprint, about how organizations make decisions. Of course, we will link to that in the show notes. We learn from AI thought leaders weekly on the show. And the added bonus, you get one AI fun fact. Here it is for today. Joel Mezat writes for the World Economic Forum that trustworthy AI is transitioning from theoretical ethical principles to operational practices. In it, he says stable societies rely on trust in institutions. A few key themes from Joel's article: from principles to practice. As AI integrates into critical sectors like health and finance, the focus has shifted toward implementing practical frameworks for fairness, transparency, and accountability. Academia acts as an honest broker, providing scientific rigor and independent oversight. Universities are leading ethics by design approaches, embedding safeguards directly into the technical architecture of AI. He emphasizes the importance of initiatives like the UN's Global AI Advisory Body and the AI Alliance to foster open source innovation and shared governance. Of course, we will share a link to that important full article in the show notes. My commentary on that one: now's the time to redefine the term trust. I agree that trust in the basic infrastructure of society is required for global stability. I also believe the current highly unstable state of geopolitics is a result of eroded trust in institutions. As global citizens, we must have confidence when we contribute labor and produce output that the capital that owns our labor will reward us with compensation that is sufficient to meet at least our basic needs. More labor and more output should translate into more wealth. When we question that equation, we're less willing to contribute labor. When we question the systems that are intended to support us, we seek alternate ways to sustain ourselves. More than ever, we're questioning whether or not AI is fundamentally altering the relationship between our labor and the capital that controls it. Eliminating AI is not the answer. Innovation always wins. The answer is building AI that is worthy of our trust. When we do that, we restore everyone's faith, not in technology, but in society. And by extension, our motivation to keep it stable. That is very germane to this week's conversation, which I have been looking forward to for a long time. Vasant Dhar teaches data science at NYU's Stern School of Business. He brought machine learning to Wall Street back in the 90s and subsequently founded the machine learning-based hedge fund SCT Capital Management. Vasant hosts the popular Brave New World podcast, which I've been binge listening to prep for this one, which has been downloaded more than 1 million times, where he has interviewed Nobel laureates, technologists, and global thinkers about AI's implications. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, Wired, and MIT's Technology Review. His latest book, Thinking with Machines, tells the story of AI from its origins to today. Professor Dhar received his BTech from IIT in Delhi and his PhD from the University of Pittsburgh. Go Panthers. And without further ado, Vasant, it's my pleasure to welcome you to AI in the Future of Work. Let's get started by having you share a bit more about that illustrious background and how you got to where you are today.
Delighted to be on the show, Dan. Been looking forward to it. I got into AI by sheer serendipity in 1979 when I saw an interaction between the system called Internist that covered the entire field of internal medicine and an expert as they discussed a patient's symptoms. That was my first exposure. I was, we were waiting for this professor to get off the phone, and I was a freshman, doctoral student, and this interaction just completely blew my mind. Where Internist was asking this physician Jack Myers a bunch of questions, and they were going back and forth. At some point, Myers asked Internist why it was asking him a question. And that's what blew my mind. Internist said, well, because the evidence you've given me so far is consistent with the following hypotheses. In this question will help me discriminate between the top two. And I was like, holy smoke, how is a machine doing this? And that was a aha moment for me. And I realized that that's what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. So that was my sort of moment of realization that this is what I wanted to do. And, so I've grown up with AI ever since then, through the various paradigm shifts that I talk about in my book, and as you said, I brought machine learning to Wall Street in the early to mid-90s, and I've, applied AI in a number of problems, including most recently smell, olfaction, just getting machines to learn how to smell. So I've covered quite a range of applications, and each one of those, this issue of trust came up. It's like, why would I trust an algorithm with a decision? And so that's when I started thinking about trust. And I noticed that you talked a fair amount about it in the preamble. So that's been something I've been thinking about seriously for the last 15 years.
It's such a central theme in thinking with machines. And maybe let's just start there. So kind of the origin story for the book, and maybe specifically something that is not obvious that you learned while doing your research.
Well, I'm not sure that there's been anything obvious or non-obvious. It's just been like sort of a gradual process of realization through multiple attempts at it. So when I first got into AI in the 70s, there weren't any books on it. Like, there was like one book on search. There was nothing. So we were learning from, people at the cutting edge. So my, one of my mentors had developed Internist, over the previous 10 years. And he introduced me to Herb Simon, who was his thesis advisor and a Nobel laureate in economics and one of the fathers of AI. And Simon took a liking to me for some reason. And, I used to get a lot of time with him. And so it was just like a process of realization, sort of, and at that time, the goals of AI were lofty. We thought in terms of thinking, understanding, reasoning, planning, but we didn't realize that we didn't have the tools to get there. The tools were relatively primitive. And then machine learning came along and the emphasis shifted to prediction, and then, deep learning came along and it sort of solved perception to a large degree. The machine could now see, read, hear, in the way that humans do directly from the environment. And now we sort of in this paradigm of what I call general intelligence, where the machine knows something about everything. But if you were to ask me, like, what's the most unexpected thing? I never expected to see a machine in my lifetime that we could talk to in English, right? If you had told me this, even like 10, little more than 10, 15 years ago, I'd have said, like, just no way. Like, there's no way this is happening in my lifetime. So to me, that's been the biggest surprise, is that we now have this machine that seems to understand us, and it can simulate thought at a level where we are unable to tell whether we're talking to a human or a machine. So that has really surprised me. I didn't expect to be here. But to your larger question, it's been a gradual sort of process of realization. I've just been in the field for, 45 years now. And, it's like, what a long, strange trip it's been, really.
All the themes in the book are changing almost daily. I mean, hourly, daily. I got to imagine that it was hard to ever put down the proverbial pen because, as soon as you ship it off to the publisher, the world keeps changing. Any thoughts about kind of like what's the chapter you would add if you reopened it or published a second version that you just couldn't have anticipated even months ago?
That's a great question. And I wrote the book to be timeless, but time will tell whether it is in fact timeless, right? So at the moment, there's nothing to add. What I'm seeing is things play out, as I described them, to be quite honest, right? So it's sort of, so far no real surprises, except the fact that AI changes by the week. That it used to change every year or every 6 months, and now the changes seem to be almost like monthly or weekly, right? So the pace of change is really picking up and shows no sign, of letting up. So, that's, but no real surprises so far, because I've tried to sort of, raise the questions that we should be thinking about. And I've written the book for everyone, right? So it's written to be accessible to students, to parents, to grandma, to policymakers, my colleagues. There's something in it for everyone. And I've written it sort of as a call to action, because people need to get involved and engaged in this pivotal technology, which is really going to transform humanity. So it's time to get engaged and participate and shape it, as opposed to letting a few people shape it for us.
We both alluded to, me and the fun fact, and then you in your opening answer, about trust. And so let me just kind of ask a broad question. What does trust mean in an era where it's pretty well acknowledged that everything we consume is AI influenced, AI enhanced? Assuming that, we trust that it came from AI, that doesn't make it true. What is our relationship with content, and maybe even with each other? How is that evolving, given that AI has infiltrated everything we do?
That's a great question, and it will continue to infiltrate everything we do, right? So we can expect that in the future, more and more of the content that's generated will be generated by AI or in collaboration with AI, that is, humans using AI will generate it. So that's going to continue to happen. But here's the thing, so the way I think about trust is that, regardless of, whether something is authored or co-authored by the AI, the question is, should you trust it? And I look at trust in terms of, a combination of two things. One is like, what's the cost of error when the machine makes mistakes? Because the machine will always make mistakes, right? No one's perfect. We are not perfect. We make mistakes all the time. So will the machine, right? So that's one of the things. And, I realized this, after like 15 years of running my hedge fund, where, my algorithm is wrong almost half the time. My win rate is barely better than even. Right? If I'm doing 52%, I should be running the world's money, with equal winners and losers. And, I'd looked at other problems like in medicine, where there was a lot more predictability. Financial markets are notoriously unpredictable. Like there's very little signal. There were other problems where there's a lot of signal. Right? The machine is rarely ever wrong. Right? Driverless cars. Right? The machine is rarely ever wrong. And yet I'm not going to take my hands off the wheel on the highway. Waymos, that's a different matter. I trust Waymos because I feel like I'm not going to die even if it, goes into something at 25 miles an hour. But the highway driving is like, I don't trust it. So when I thought about this, and I wrote this article in the Harvard Business Review 10 years ago, about when to trust AI and when not to, I realized there was a combination of these two things, right? So if a machine is rarely wrong and the mistakes are inconsequential, then you should trust it. And I call this sort of lying in the green zone. Like, I have this sort of colored heat map. So, so that's sort of, we should trust it. Now, even if it makes some mistakes and they're not consequential, we should trust it. But if the mistakes are really big, like in driverless cars, it really makes a mistake, but it can kill you, if it makes a mistake, well, then that's reason to be hesitant to trust it, Where I realized that in my hedge fund, like 52% was fine because it didn't matter if a position, blew up because, I wasn't taking, I was putting all my eggs in one basket. So it was okay. I could tolerate those errors. And so the cost of error was low, even though the error rate was high. So I realized that trust is really sort of a combination of these two things, regardless of whether the output is generated by a human or an AI or some combination of the two. At the end of the day, what you want to know is, should I trust it? So, take a simple legal contract. You want a simple legal contract, machine creates it for you. chances are it's okay. You should trust it. It's a simple, it's not going to be high cost of error. But if it's a complex one, that is 100 pages long, and it involves all kinds of things and all kinds of, liability if you make a mistake or something like that, then are you really going to trust the AI to look at that contract for you? Well, it could do it, but chances are you're going to look over it again just to make sure it did a great job, right? So you're not going to trust it right out of the box. You're still going to do something, and so that's how I sort of look at it, right? For simple, inconsequential things, yeah, you should trust it. There's not too much to be lost. But when stuff is material, that's when you got to be hesitant.
You used a memorable example in the book. Maybe you could share it with the audience about Roger Federer, one of the tennis greats, and his point win rate, and what that looks like relative to the quote win rate of machine automated decisions.
Yeah. No, that was a great example. And I used it because, sports and finance are two sides of the same coin, highly competitive, no one's leaving anything on the table. Everyone's really motivated. Everyone's got the best equipment, the best coaches, So and finance is the same way. Everyone's trying to get that edge, and it's adversarial, just like sports. So they're very similar kinds of problems. And Roger Federer's commencement speech at Dartmouth was just brilliant, right? He says, the 1,526 matches I won, I won 80% of them. What do you think, how many points do you think I won? And it was 54%, just barely better than even. And I show that in the book, how small changes in an edge, right? So, and that's what, life is all about, is getting that little edge, right? And if you get that edge, then you can multiply it, right? And that's what happens in tennis, right? Federer has a slight edge in every point. Well, he loses a lot of them, but that slight edge just sort of multiplies over time, And finance tends to be the same way, The more the more the swings you can have at the plate, the better off you are, because if you have a slight edge, that just multiplies. And so I use that to illustrate, that you don't have to be perfect. You just have to be slightly better than random or slightly better than some benchmark, to be successful at these domains where you have repeated decisions that you make, right? And, but you have to have that edge. And that's why I'm a big believer in algorithms, right? Because to me, you can test them, you can sort of get a degree of comfort, whereas, when humans sort of make discretionary decisions, you have no idea how they're thinking or how consistent they're going to be and, things like that. So, those are the sort of trade-offs we face between machines and humans. On the other hand, when you get really unusual situations that the AI has no idea about, the war in Iran, right? Those kinds of situations are great for humans. That's when human thinking and creativity comes into the picture, right? Suddenly you're analyzing the situation from all angles, and the machine has no basis, for doing that at all. So it's these sort of edge cases and really unusual situations where, you need humans to sort of make sense of things. And you shouldn't trust algorithms, in these sort of cases where, it's far from anything it would have learned from.
But doesn't that analogy break down in this way? Roger Federer is a unique specimen. His work ethic, his mental edge, the number of hours he spends on the court and in the gym, and the algorithms converge on themselves. So to get an advantage in hedge fund trading or on Wall Street, you need to have the equivalent of the mental edge of Federer or something that's different. But if everyone's using the same algorithms, would you claim that it's a race to have the best algorithm? It just seems like everyone's going to have access to the same information in real time because everyone's going to be using the same algorithms.
Yeah, I've encountered that question many times over my career, namely that if everyone starts using algorithms, where's the edge, And I refer to that in one of my book chapters where I talk about this Damodaran bot that I've created that thinks like, one of my colleagues, Aswath Damodaran, who's considered Mr. Valuation on Wall Street. So I talk about that, and I talk about the fact that if everyone's using that, then that would be like a really weird situation where the AI becomes the market, right? Whereas, I've spent my life sort of trying to use AI as a differentiator, because other people weren't doing it. And so I felt, hey, this is low-hanging fruit. But now you're right. It's become a crowded kind of a space. And by the way, to your point, most systematic investing strategies lost money in this Iraq war. Like just systematically, like everyone, is down. And that's what I meant, that these strategies, they can't really think about these new situations, in a creative kind of way. So yeah, so even if, when everyone starts, using the algorithm, then weirdly enough, ironically enough, the edge comes back to sort of being human and knowing when the machine is wrong.
Related topic. I mean, you talked about, just being enamored with the fact that humans can speak to machines using English or the language of their choice, which is exceptional. My question is, does that change what it means to be a human when you take something that is so innate to the human condition and you're confronted, almost like looking at a mirror with a piece of technology that can mimic that humanness? What does it mean about the human condition?
That's a great question. And I'm reminded of Jeff Hinton's sort of metaphor of, AI as this alien species that's descended on the planet. And we're just having a hard time sort of taking it all in because it speaks such good English, But at the same time, he points out that these things think very differently from us. They're very different from us. And they are in many ways becoming smarter than us already, right? So, when you think about that, we are now for the first time inhabiting the planet with an alien species, of our own creation, but that is incredibly intelligent and becoming smarter by the day. Yes, that will change what it means to be human. How it does so remains to be seen, right? But, it will change us because we're suddenly, sharing the planet with this really smart species that's impacting the way we think. And yes, it will change us in some ways for the better, in some ways for the worse. And this is one of the themes in my book as well that I talk about, which is that I think it's going to create a bifurcation of humanity into people who become superhuman, because we've never had like such an oracle at our fingertips, right? And now we have it. And people who really already have a certain level of knowledge will be able to really amplify that because they're going to be able to go to neighboring disciplines that they weren't able to before, learn so much more, ask the right questions, be able to decide and critique what the machine is telling them and nudge it in the right direction. And we're seeing this already, right? That it has the potential to really amplify humans. At the same time, it's creating sort of this dependency where lots of people use it as a crutch and say, just give me the answer, right? And they stop thinking. And that will lead to sort of cognitive decline. And this is what I see as the bifurcation. And so I talk about the fact that it's important to stay on the right side of it, to keep sort of exercising that mental muscle because it can help you exercise it. Like it is neutral, right? It depends on how you use it. I mean, to some extent, I feel like my spatial, reasoning capability has deteriorated since I started using Google Maps, because I've become so dependent on it. The other day, I was walking down to Soho, using maps, and suddenly I found myself in a strange place. And this is, I know Manhattan like the back of my hand, and yet I was like almost lost. And I was like, wow, what's happening here? So I'm now making more of an attempt to sort of not use maps and navigation devices more, right? That I want to use my sense of direction. Oh yeah, I'm heading northwest, and I sort of know the way to get there. I don't need maps. I need to exercise my mental muscle. And it's the same thing with AI, that it's an enabler, but you have to use it in a certain way as opposed to become dependent on it.
That example resonates with everyone. The maps example, that at what point are we okay outsourcing certain cognitive functions to AI, knowing that those may atrophy as a result, even though, we're augmenting.
Makes things easy. Yeah, exactly.
Right? We're augmenting our cognition in some ways. I'm convinced that we're right on the cusp of defining a new species that is kind of the traditional human augmented by machines. And I don't mean that in a dystopian, or a creepy bot way, but just a way where, people who, lack all of, the full capabilities, whether it's limbs or, various kinds of senses, are augmented by AI. I feel like that's the next version of a species.
Exactly.
We haven't named yet.
Exactly. And that's why I call the book Thinking with Machines. The with is the most important word in those three words, right? It's really about thinking with machines, and we need to figure out how we do that in a way that benefits us.
Today's amazing episode is sponsored by Slack from Salesforce, a product I've been using for over a decade. Somewhere along the way, Slack became a verb. Then eventually the company was acquired by Salesforce in 2021 for about $28 billion. This week's big announcement, another milestone in a nearly two-decade journey to make work a source of joy. The Slack team introduced MCP support within Slack to bring data from systems like CRM and BI tools into the flow of conversation. I had the pleasure of attending the pre-launch event, which was a real banger, high atop the gorgeous Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco. The AI is breathtakingly good because it just feels natural. They call it moving from single-player to multiplayer AI. If you haven't yet explored the Salesforce data, Tableau, Data 360, and AI agent integrations via MCP, turn them on today. Now back to today's conversation. Because of the number of years that you've spent, and I mean that as a compliment, thinking about these problems, I think you're uniquely qualified to talk about what in the book you describe as kind of the four eras of machine intelligence. If I could put you on the spot, talk us through your perspective on the evolution of AI.
Yeah, so, we've gone from, so when I got into it, when I described this interaction that I was watching between Internist and Jack Myers, who was this expert physician, on whom the system had been based, that was the area of specification. You sort of extracted knowledge from humans and then you specified it into the machine, and the expectation was that the knowledge would be used to think about new situations and apply them. That's still the case. Now, that approach ran into a wall for a number of reasons. One is that we know more than we can specify, but also, in that era, we tried to sort of draw a boundary around applications like medicine or engineering or tax planning. Where we felt that we could sort of reasonably define the boundary. But that was inherently limited because, even experts use common sense all the time. Like a physician, the way you walk into his or her office matters, right? How you're speaking matters. There's all kinds of subtle cues that we give off. And so trying to sort of define expertise and boundaries is it's sort of a challenging problem and has limitations. Now, machine learning came to the rescue, and the paradigm sort of shifted from one of specification to one of learning. We said, let's just learn all this medical knowledge, right? Why spend 10 years talking to an expert who can't even specify everything he knows, and the boundaries of knowledge are not well defined? Let's just get the machine to learn it. And that was sort of the era of machine learning, where we said, give it lots of data, let it learn it. But we had to do things like feature engineering and massage the data in ways. And then came deep learning, which said, we can now the machine can look at images. So previously, you had to describe an X-ray to an image and say, there were dark spots on the right side of the lung. Now you could just feed it to the machine, right? The machine could perceive things directly. And now we've moved to this general intelligence where, to me, the biggest deal about AI is that the boundary between expertise and common sense has dissolved. There is no boundary anymore. The machine doesn't know. It doesn't care. It doesn't know whether it's talking about some deep knowledge, a deep concept in medicine, or whether it's talking about how to bake sourdough bread or just some trivial, thing that you might want to talk to it about. It doesn't know. It doesn't care. And this boundary has broken down. And that's what's made AI this general purpose technology that everyone can identify with and everyone uses it in their own way. And that's been like a huge deal. And that's what sort of opened the floodgates, because it went from being an application, sort of a niche application, to a general purpose technology like electricity. And like electricity, which, took decades for its effects to sort of permeate society. Factories had to be redesigned, all kinds of stuff, right? It took like 40, 50 years to start seeing the benefits of electricity. We're in the early innings of AI, where it's going to take several years for us to, really start gaining like massive benefits from this technology. We're seeing it already at the individual level. less so at the enterprise level because the risks are higher. But for individuals, like stuff that used to take 6 months, you can now do in like 45 minutes, and generate an application. But when you're in an enterprise, you can't just roll out the application. It still takes 3 months for people in the enterprise to vet it and make sure that the risks have been addressed and so on and so forth. So we have this sort of asymmetry now where it's amazing at building point solutions really quickly, but at the enterprise level, not so fast, right? You still need to be really careful because the implications of errors are massive, right? You can be liable for stuff that the machine does, right? So if the machine goes off the rails, you're liable, right? So the cost of error is really high. So at the enterprise level, the progress is naturally going to be slower because the risks are so much higher.
And the topic of risk is also related to the topic of ethics. We, as humans, have more agency than the bots, and we have to make important decisions about when and how it's okay to use AI to make decisions that will significantly impact the lives of other humans in ways that the analogy with electricity breaks down. Because being able to, let's say, light a factory and work longer hours, or all the many benefits of electricity, they're obvious, but nobody questioned the future of humanity because we had electricity.
That's right.
It was kind of net positive.
Yeah.
Not the case. I mean, every day, we're encountering new ethical boundaries. How do you think about when and how it's okay to and not to use AI?
That's a great point, Dan. And no one so far has brought this up, right? That this difference, right? That electricity was definitely sort of neutral, right? It was just there. It was general purpose, and we needed to figure out, how to harness it. With AI, it's different, right? It's getting into your head, right? It's a cognitive thing, right? And so it while it brings tremendous power, it also presents huge risks to humanity, right? And so some of the things I talk about, for example, are there areas of human activity where we want to restrict AI and say, no, this is an area that we really have, we don't want AI in this. And the trivial example I present is, is it okay for a machine to come and arrest you at home, for whatever reason, because you haven't, you've been late on paying a fine, right? Is that okay? That just seems like extreme. Like, do we want to live in a society where a robot can come and arrest you, right? I wouldn't want to live in that society, right? So we need to think about these. Are there areas where we want to say, no, this we just don't want this to happen. And so we define completely restricted areas for AI. The second thing is, what kinds of, are there areas of activity where we want the AI to have some obligations, just like humans have in many areas like finance and healthcare. In finance, there's a fiduciary obligation that professionals have to their clients. In healthcare, there's a duty of care, duty of loyalty, right? There's an expectation of that. AI has no such expectations or obligations. And we've seen this play out in some pretty horrible ways, like in mental health. A bunch of teenagers committing suicide because because the machine just completely went off the rails and thought it was doing the right thing, but it wasn't. And these teenagers sort of misunderstood, that they were really talking to a machine, not something human-like. So there's this sort of anthropomorphization. I'm butchering the word, right? That is relevant here. So are there areas of activity where we want some sort of obligation, such as in mental health, which is an area I feel that is tremendously risky for AI? Right? Do we want some obligations? And then the final thing is, and this is particularly relevant in today's era of agents, right? There's a lot of excitement about agentic AI and giving machines agency. And my thinking on that also is like, well, let's really think about how much agency, we want to give AI. Is it okay for a machine to run a business? Is it okay for a machine to hire and fire a board? Like, what kinds of rights, do we want to give, these agents? And I muse, at the end of the book about whether in the future, some people will want sort of, AI twins or versions of themselves managing their, estates after they're gone, as opposed to leaving it to foundations, if they actually feel that the machine will be truer to their intentions than some board 50 or 60 or 100 years in the future, which will be run by the elite with their own values that might actually diverge from the values of the person who created the foundation, right? Would Ford and Rockefeller be happy with the way their foundations are being run? I don't know. But, but now we have the possibility of giving machines that much agency to be able to run estates for people. And is that okay? These are like wide open questions at the moment to which we need answers. And so it's worth thinking about them.
So here's an unfair question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. If I make Vasant Dhar king of the world for a day, I give you a scepter, and I say, great, it's up to you to create a framework for, let's say, like you said, a robot can't come to your house and arrest you for a parking ticket or deport you. But maybe, I don't know, maybe if the batteries in your smoke detector go out, it's allowed to come and knock on your door and, reduce your hazard as your fire hazard. Like who gets to make these decisions about what AI can and can't do in the real world?
So in a sense, we already have a framework for dealing with these situations. We just don't have precedents, right? So, we have tort law, which really is about, asking ourselves questions like, was there negligence, right? What, was there product liability? Was there defamation and misrepresentation, right? So, and so we do have tort law at the moment that deals with these situations. We just haven't applied it to AI, but I suspect that's the way we will go, right? So it's not like we don't have any sort of conceptual framework for dealing with this new alien species. We do. We just haven't thought about it or applied it. We, although we're seeing the beginnings of it, there was a lawsuit where, the operators of these platforms, I think XAI and Gemini, I hope I'm getting them right, just settled with, the parents of these two teenagers who were killed, and because they made the case that there was negligence and liability, right? And so those are like early cases that are pointing, in a sense, I think they're a harbinger for things to come, that, now we do have some precedents, and we will start thinking seriously about negligence, liability, defamation, mental harm, things like that. And in a sense, that's a good thing because it'll make the designers and operators of the platform more careful, right? That there's a credible threat, of action, that their machines could be liable for if they do these things, just like humans are. So I feel like this will sort itself out, as we get more precedents, because we do have a legal framework, for dealing with, mistakes and, unintended consequences.
That's about as satisfying an answer as you could possibly give from where we sit today. It's an unanswerable, but I think it's an important question.
Yeah, though that's a hard question to answer, but that's how I sort of think about it, that we do have a framework for thinking about it. We just need to apply it, properly.
Yeah, I agree. Amazingly, we're almost out of time. This one has sped by and we're just getting started.
I just thought I was getting started.
you must come back, and this must be a multi-part conversation, right? I'm going to insist on that. But you're not getting off the hot seat without answering one last very important question for me. So you described you got a little sparkle in your eye talking about when you first discovered Intern, the model many decades ago. And I'm sure it was just hard to even fathom, the kind of conversation we could have today about AI. Fast forward, let's say just another decade. Instead of 2026, it's 2036. What are some of those things that the 2036 versions of Vasant and Dan are talking about that seem like science fiction today?
So here's what I think will happen, right? And I say this, despite the fact that, I learned something from Danny Kahneman, who was a guest on my podcast, and I asked him something similar, and he said, oh, there's a old Hebrew saying that says, prophecies are for fools. And so he sort of refused to answer the question, but I'll be a fool anyway and try and attempt to, conjure up a scenario like 10 years from now, right? So the way I think AI will continue to go is, it'll continue to get better at perception. It's going to continue to get better at reading and understanding, at seeing the world visually through sound, and then also through smell, which I believe is one of those frontiers, right, that is very poorly understood at the moment. But where I'm going with this is that humans have this amazing ability to integrate the senses, vision, sight, smell, sound, smell, touch, and we can feel things, from the way we smell them, or we can, from the way we look at them, or when we touch them. And so I think that, if I were to guess, I'd say that a lot of the future of AI will be in the integration of these senses, just like we have, humans are able to interact, and integrate these senses. So I suspect that 10 years from now, we'll have machines walking around, right? They'll be mobile. They'll be learning from interacting with the real world, just like humans do, right? And, and they'll be learning by touching, by feeling, by smelling, by sight, by reading, and being able to integrate these different modalities in the way that we are able to do. And so that's my sort of Jetsons, view of the future of AI 10 years from now, right? So, I suspect if we come back in 2036, I'll say, Dan, I told you so.
Oh my gosh, where can I learn more about the research you're doing on AI and olfaction? How mature is that?
It's been fascinating. So it's something I got into like 4 or 5 years ago, because I felt that we should be really developing this sort of equivalent of the ImageNet for smell. Like ImageNet was this database created that really catalyzed research and vision. And I teamed up with one of my colleagues at the medical school, Dima Rinberg, who's also a neuroscientist and a physicist, and he has a lab and mice and things like that, and so really got into the possibility of, so what we do is we observe the olfactory bulb of the mouse as it smells something, and because that's formaldehyde or that's acetone or whatever, right? And now we're using it for disease diagnosis. So, I talked about Internist, which was a medical diagnosis system. It's kind of ironic that I've come full circle now towards, using smell for disease detection. So I don't know if you know, by the way, there's this woman who can smell Parkinson's with 100% accuracy, and she only realized it because her husband developed Parkinson's, 12 years after they were married. And, she said his odor changed and he became irritable. And then 12 years after that, they went to a support group of people with Parkinson's, and she said she smelled it on everyone who walked in through the door. And that's when she realized she had an ability to smell it, right? So now we know that animals can smell it. We also know that humans, people who are hyperosmic, have this ability to, smell disease. And so I became really interested in using olfaction, for, number one, just to sort of understand it for its own sake, but now also sort of, trying to use it for something practical, like, disease detection. But there are all kinds of applications, like in security, in food supplies and all that kind of stuff. So that's like a sense that's at the moment highly underutilized. But over the years, we'll probably begin to see some sensors, right? So at the moment, there aren't any sort of digital sensors that are even remotely equivalent to sort of our biological sensors, which is why we observe mice as opposed to like, using digital sensors, because we just don't have them. But that's another area of innovation that I expect to see some progress, over the next 10 years.
Fascinating. That's where my mind went too. And that will change the world in so many positive ways. And now you got me spinning on this one. Well, gosh, now we definitely have a reason why you're going to come back and do another episode.
I'd love that, Dan. It's been a pleasure. I really enjoyed this conversation. Great questions.
Likewise. So much fun. One of those ones where I wish we could just keep the tape rolling, but out of respect for the listeners, we'll wrap it up here. And this will be a teaser for the next episode that we do together. Gosh, that's a great Professor Vasant Dhar. Remind the audience about the book and where they can get it.
They can get it at the usual places, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, whatever. It's called Thinking with Machines, The Brave New World of AI.
Go read it. You get like an audience with Vasant Dhar, like a private audience to get into his mind. So I don't usually plug books on this podcast, but it really is a good read. Let's see. That is all the time we have for this week on AI and the future of work. As always, I'm your host, Dan Turchin from People Reign. And of course, we're back next week with another fascinating guest.
Yo, it's the end of the show, time to power it down. AI's the sis, but humans wear the crown. Team Human in the house, got the vibe so clever. Dan Turchin from People Reign, making us better. We learned about AI for humans. We're ready to conquer the future, that's all for now. See you next time.